All right, I want to welcome you to LaRouche PAC's Monday night discussion. I'm Susan Kokinda, and tonight Mike Steger will be presenting the strategic overview. I want to start right out by sharing the screen and highlighting an article which we posted today, which was written by Barbara Boyd and is on our website, and I encourage everyone to read this very carefully, including following a lot of the links that are in it to really ground yourself in the nature of the strategic crisis which we're in right now. As you can see from the title, Will Biden's War Deliver Humanity's Very Last October Surprise? With a picture of Goofy Joe standing in front of a mushroom cloud. This article, in a sense, is a bit of a prelude to a special discussion we're going to be following up this discussion with next Saturday during our normal Saturday class series time slot. Because the nature of the period that we're in right now demands a quality of leadership and thinking, which a few people in recent history have demonstrated, a quality of thinking which, to put it in common terms, is outside the box. But by that, what we really mean is recognizing that the existing system that we're operating in, the globalist system, the era of central banking that has come to dominate much of the world over the recent period, that system is coming to an end. And the leaders of that system, in a sense, know that. They're desperate. They're desperate to hang on to their power. Perhaps they know they can't hang on to the system in its current form, but they're desperate to hang on to their power and are willing to gamble with anything. Hence, our idiotic president blithely talking about thermonuclear war. And as Donald Trump pointed out in his interview with his daughter-in-law, Laura Trump, last week, you just don't do that. You don't throw these ideas around, especially as president of the United States. This is the height of irresponsibility and insanity. But again, if you recognize that we are at the end of this system, and I think Mike will be describing in more detail tonight, the nature of the financial distress that the global elites are in, the physical economic distress that the nations of the world are in, it underscores the fact that these guys are in a very, very desperate frame of mind. Now, this is happening, of course, in the 4-week countdown to the midterm elections, which for most of us will probably be the most momentous elections of our lifetimes, because of the nature of the strategic and the economic crisis that we're in. And to put a fine point on it, some of our organizers here in Michigan are going to go out organizing tomorrow with the sign that says, "Want peace? Devastate the Democrats in November." Because we are at the kind of point, unless you deliver a shock to the existing regime, that their policies are being completely rejected by the American people, their insanity is going to go unchecked. Now, I want to, again, as a kind of prelude or preview for our further discussion on Saturday, briefly take people back to 1976, because we were at, in the countdown to the 1976 presidential election, which was a race between the incumbent Gerald Ford and the Trilateral Commission's hand-picked president, Jimmy Carter. This was also the first time that Lyndon LaRouche ran for president. And we managed back in 1976 to scrape together our pennies and our dimes and our nickels and a few other things and purchase a half hour of national television time. And remember, back then there were only 3 national stations. I think it was at 10:55 p.m. and I can't remember which of the national networks we bought it on, for Mr. LaRouche to make an address to the American people about the significance of this election. And in that address, he warned that Carter and really Carter's controllers within the Trilateral Commission were pursuing lunatic policies which opened up a deeper danger of thermonuclear war. So this has been, our organization has been conversant with this danger for a very, very long time. But I wanted to bring that up because of what happened subsequently. We did not stop Jimmy Carter, although back then we did go to court and actually made some progress, not enough, in exposing a certain level of vote fraud. I'm talking about 1976 for the YouTube censors. We're not talking about 2020. So hopefully they won't take this webcast down because I uttered the words vote fraud. But despite the fact that Carter became president of the United States, Mr. LaRouche's broadcast on election, well, it was a couple of nights before the election, caught the eye of various patriotic layers in the United States who recognized the understanding, the quality of thinking that LaRouche demonstrated in this extraordinary broadcast, briefing the American people in 1976 on the Trilateral Commission, on their various nefarious policies and what the consequences of them would be, and began to open up certain lines of communication between LaRouche and ultimately the Reagan administration, to the point that when Ronald Reagan got elected president of the United States, Lyndon LaRouche was brought in to function as a back channel between the Reagan administration and the Soviet government for the purpose of exploring a way out of the still existing strategic crisis, which existed as long as we operate under a regime of mutual and assured destruction, which exists as long as you have a global elite that has the ability to use nuclear weapons to play political chicken with other nations in the world. Reagan, like Donald Trump, hated the idea of mutual and assured destruction and was looking for a way out, and saw in the proposal that Mr. LaRouche developed over the years of using particle beam weapons, directed energy weapons, lasers, other things like that, as a way of actually eliminating the threat of thermonuclear ICBMs, using new physical principles, new technologies, as a way of getting out of the box of mutual and assured destruction. And as people know, on March 23rd, 1983, President Reagan made a shocking, especially to the enemy, speech in which he announced precisely that policy, became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. Unfortunately, of course, that same global elite did everything possible to undermine the actual implementation of a new defense doctrine based on new physical principles. And as Mr. LaRouche made very clear, based on using this as a science driver to energize and reshape our entire economy. So here we are in 2022, 4 weeks before another election, with another Democratic president playing with the danger of thermonuclear weapons as part of the geopolitical chessboard of this global elite. But we are finding ourselves in a situation where, while Mr. LaRouche is no longer with us, his ideas certainly are, And we have other critical figures in the United States who also think outside the box, like Donald Trump, who offered to negotiate, like Elon Musk, who similarly has put forward very creative approach to dealing with the crisis between Russia and Ukraine. And it's that kind of thinking of people who don't live in the world of the narrative, of people who don't live in the globalist system. It's that kind of thinking that we really have to radiate throughout the population in these critical 4 weeks before this election and beyond. So with that, Mike, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Yeah, if you haven't watched the, haven't watched the 1976 broadcast, you certainly should. The level of foresight, including, as Susan mentioned, election integrity in places like California. Lyndon LaRouche was just out there, out front, speaking truth to the nation about the crisis today that we're facing. So, as you mentioned, Barbara Boyd's got an article posted on the website which gives a good strategic overview. So I again recommend, and Susan will probably post that in the chat here so people can just access it and read it once we're done. Again, just thanks for attending and participating in these. These are hopefully a discussion process. I don't really see these as so much YouTube material, but more so a chance to discuss with active citizens, members of the LaRouche organization, LaRouche movement, who are people that at least are curious about what we're doing, but to engage in a dialogue of citizens about how we address the strategic crisis. And in some ways, unlike in many years in the past, it's not simply just a crisis. And that's where many people, or perhaps the best way to put it is when a colonel was once asked, what's the first thing you do with a new war? You fire all the generals. That we have to do something fundamentally different than what we've been doing, even in terms of resistance to this system. It's really upon us to use our creative thoughts, to use a sense of how do we respond to a situation no one has ever faced before. There's no history book or anecdote or story or example that in and of itself provides a roadmap. The roadmap is us. It is our minds. It is our passions and devotions. It is our capability of collaboration. So what I'm going to do tonight is dive more into some of the specifics of the strategic situation, cover that so that we can have a discussion in that context. I think people have thoughts, have questions, or reports, insights in that regard. I think it's safe to say that it's been a long time since such a movement like this in the United States has existed, if ever. In some sense, there was the wide awake movement. And this is something Bob Ingram has referenced in some of his Lincoln discussions. But what we have developing, and I'm going to come back to this at the end of my remarks, what's developing in this country is really a truly remarkable dynamic. And it is, with all irony intended, but zero sarcasm, the most diverse political movement this country, and perhaps any country, has ever seen in the world. But it's not liberal. It's not neoliberal. It is one that calls forth that question of the American Revolution. You know, Ulysses S. Grant himself participated in what was called the Wide Awakes, and this was, you know, kind of young men organizing themselves for what they saw was a kind of political battle that ultimately culminated in then the Civil War and the rebellion of the southern states. But Grant, a retired, I think, major in the U.S. Army, went to their events, were in discussions, and it was mobilizing around the new Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln at that time. And in some sense, there's something like that happening today. And I can say with certainty that despite the specific outcomes of any race or the number of races, though I have to say, if you're still kind of biting your fingernails regarding this election, stop, engage in the population. We're looking at a real potential victory. As Susan said, decimating the Democrats is very possible. But more than anything, what we're coming out of with this election in the course of 4 weeks and into the next period is a much more organized, battle-tested political movement in this country. You can call it Ultra Maga. I kind of like the name simply because, you know, it's like when Hillary Clinton called us deplorables. You know, you kind of embrace it. You know, the reference to Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables. You know, it's like we'll identify in the sense that there's a certain, we know that we outnumber the enemy, that we are many, they are few. But there is a profound movement developing in this country. And so if you're not situated there every day, if you haven't been to some of the Trump rallies, if you haven't been to some of the grassroots events, if you haven't had a chance to engage with this kind of outpouring in the population, trust me on this one, take me at face value, but then also get out and engage it. But it is something that every day you want to remember that what we're participating in is not merely a kind of a frenetic engagement with every possible election. Certainly that's true, from city councils, county commissioners, school boards, state assemblies, to statewide races and federal elections. But there is something far more profound happening in the context of people engaging in so many different myriad ways to win this election, to bring a new Republican Party to bear. If people haven't noticed, Paul Gosar came out directly and said, end all funding to Ukraine. He's a Republican congressman from Arizona, but he came out and said, end all funding to Ukraine, that we have no interest in this war at all. We need an army of those in the House and in the Senate. We need an army of people that are willing to speak out on those kinds of federal national issues, even from state offices, to make it clear that we are no longer going down the road of any globalist faction, Republican, Democrat, or whatever. And that we are going to redemonstrate the principle of national sovereignty in our country and make it possible for every other. So that said, I think everyone's quite aware that over the course of the last few days, that the situation in Ukraine has reached a much more complicated or intense dynamic. Now, this really starts weeks ago with the bombing of Nord Stream 2. Now, if you're unaware, or Nord Stream 1 and 2, there was a series of bombings. I think most people are aware of the bombings. There was bombings of Nord Stream 1 and 2. These are the pipelines that run near St. Petersburg of Russia through the Baltic Sea and end up in northern Germany and provide gas to Germany and other parts of Europe. Large amounts of gas. Now, they were bombed. There's 200 feet in depth. So it's not something that, you know, local divers are going to be able to do. This is going to be an intense naval exercise to pull this off. So it was clearly a targeted attack. On who? Well, largely on Germany. And in some sense on the global population, because what Germany represents, one of the most advanced industrial economies in the world, heavy production of everything. But what's been determined is that in each pipeline, in Nord Stream 1 and 2, there are two strings, two separate pipes. One of the pipes in Nord Stream 2, or one of the strings, remains viable. Now, this is to the chagrin of this British Anglo faction, Biden regime, the Biden collective, the Poles, others who are fanatically NATO zealots for war with Russia, that didn't work out so successful. But what we've seen is a string of then attempted attacks. There were attempts even on the Turk Stream, another pipeline going through Turkey into Southeast Europe, but that was largely prevented. But certainly what escalated over the weekend was a bombing of what we could call the Crimean Bridge, a bridge that was built by Russia from the southern part of Russia west to the Crimean Peninsula. It's the longest bridge in Europe. And apparently 3 people were killed, and apparently it was somebody who driving a truck that didn't even know that they were participating in a terrorist act. In response to that, Russia has launched a series of targeted precision strike attacks on various parts of the infrastructure of Ukraine, including a clear threat. They bombed a few cars outside the Ukrainian intelligence building in Kiev. So clearly just a very, very obvious warning shot that at any minute we could decimate all of you who work there. And basically we will if such terrorist attacks on the infrastructure of Russia continue. Now, to what extent all of this happened, there are various reports. As some worthwhile people have said, anything that comes out of Kiev, you should just disregard it out of hand. So to what extent how many sites were targeted and struck, the reports approximate a dozen. It could be very well far more than that. And the hints about Russian capabilities and what they have yet to unleash in this special military operation, as they call it, made it clear why this is not a war, why it's not even really a counter-terror operation, why it remains a special military operation. As many of you know, the 4 regions have voted to a large scale to join the Russian Federation as oblasts or provinces within Russia. This goes from the Donbass down to the areas just north of Crimea. It's probably to be expected that a whole other strip running from Kharkov in the northeast down to Odessa and Nikolaev would also potentially join Russia before this is all over. But what every indication points to is that as all of these reports, and I think if you're watching mainstream news or if your friends and contacts are, they're getting bombarded with Ukrainian success stories. Even the bombing of the bridge, which apparently remains totally in operation. One part of the car or automobile traffic, one side of it remains intact. I think they've just shared traffic in both directions, and the rail service is still operational. So to what extent these were victories, or the great Izium invasion or the Kherson offensive that are reported are largely overblown in every possible way, that these are merely tactical victories that Russia is willing to concede because their main interest is pulling Ukrainian troops out of their defensive positions and having as much impact upon the Ukraine army in terms of attack that they can, not to hold territory per se for the time being. Russia has called up 300,000 troops. It looks as if they'll be deployed. Those 300,000 troops will be deployed to the main defensive bases throughout Russia, and that the permanently called up troops who have been in active training would then be replaced to then deploy into the Ukrainian area. And so in all intents and purposes, what we're seeing is a potential buildup of a Russian capability to now match or outmatch the Russian military personnel deployed into the confrontation, the front lines, and a different approach towards what that territory means. It's no longer territory they're defending or merely denazifying. They intend to denazify Ukraine. They intend to eliminate the military of Ukraine, but much of this territory is now Russian, based on the treaties and laws and so on that have taken place. Is just as a quick irony, the West talks about how these polls, not polls, but the referendums in these places were illegitimate. Well, just as a note, and this happened a number of years ago, but Scotland will be holding very likely its independence vote somewhat soon. So here in the middle of the so-called Anglo world, you have Scotland who wants to declare its independence from the United Kingdom. They had one vote, and it was considered legit that you hold a vote, and if they don't want to be part of your country anymore, they're not. So it is legal, as much as they'd like to tell you otherwise when it pertains to Ukraine or Russia or some other thing. This is a legal process, and it's acknowledged in all these parts. Now, I'm not necessarily in favor of this. I'm not in favor per se of Scotland leaving the UK, partly because it's an attempt to balkanize countries in general. But the irony, of course, stands out. So this is going to escalate from the military analyst perspective. The ground in Ukraine is mostly flat. It becomes marshy and muddy in the fall with rains. And until it's frozen, you're not going to have a clear offensive. So sometime in early to mid-November, depending on temperatures, a Russian offensive will likely be launched. Now, more than anything, Putin has pulled together a mobilization of the Russian people, and the bombing of that Crimean bridge, and Crimea is certainly a sense of Russia since 1776 and Catherine the Great, that this is a real war. And much like the terrorist activity of the late 90s and early 2000s when Putin came in, it might not be a counter-terror operation, but the commitment is end this. So now, okay, so that may be an accurate assessment. I think it is. You can be the judge and we can discuss it more. What's the point? Well, the point is, this has been known the entire time. Putin, to some extent, may have thought, and many analysts did think, though, is that at some point, or even initially, that the US administration, not Biden, not his sycophants and his controllers and managers in the White House, but that the broader regime of the US would insist on an immediate negotiation to prevent an outbreak of war. And that the European countries could not be so insane and self-destructive as to adopt a policy of sanctioning their main supplier of energy. Now, many of them may have thought this wouldn't go on as long, it would end quickly. We'll do some things maybe in Europe to prevent this. But what we've seen is a kind of desperate psychosis, covered with the thin veil of senility to make it seem, I guess, more sympathetic, but with a thin veil of senility, a general desperate psychosis from this entire regime. Now, so where's this coming from? Why want to erode and destroy NATO? Why want to erode and destroy the post-war ability to maintain peace and stability, even while you continue to loot and control, which is ultimately what the neoliberal system has been. The Kissingers, the McNamaras, the Brzezinskis, the what's her name? Anyways, you know the point I'm making, though, which is keep things stable while we loot, control population, control resources, control growth, limit discussion of ideas, keep the LaRouche types out of the discussion, defame them, imprison them, persecute them, but keep them out of the discussion while we loot and control. Because at some point, that loot and control policy, and largely a control through kind of a cultural matrix, and when I say that, I mean a matrix of ideology, of doctrine, of live a life of pleasure, have fun, enjoy, live a life of good fun and good cheer, and ignore the bigger, more serious questions. That's how they've mostly have controlled the population. And you can see it's a seductive approach. Who wouldn't accept that? As long as everything seems stable to you personally, to your immediate environment, yeah, why not just enjoy it? But that's shifting. And you can see it in the political response in the United States. The police state actions, Tucker Carlson has been covering this and emphasizing it, that they're now persecuting pro-life activists. The bombings of pro-life centers, complete terror and anarchy in cities, massive destruction by organizations which are notoriously corrupt, like Black Lives Matter, that are basically synthetic constructs that have no on-the-ground relevance to the Black community, except for a bunch of perhaps in college or college-age young people that have no sense of a clear future, no sense of stability, have achieved somewhat of physical adulthood, but no clear emotional development or intellectual development from the culture they come from. And you set them, you basically light a match and it goes on fire. But they've just let havoc and mayhem reign, havoc and mayhem, nonstop, going back to Obama. It's been a decade. It wasn't just COVID. It wasn't just George Floyd. It began much earlier. And the question you have to ask is now, and they're continuing to use it. So what's happening? What's taking place? Well, we saw this over the last 2 weeks. Another reminder, it's happened in periods, and it's happened with incidents in the United States as well. There are clearly going to be factions arising out of this financial class over who has primacy or priority over survival in terms of financial survival and financial control and interest. But the Federal Reserve, for whatever reasons, and they're by all means political, have decided to start to raise interest rates substantially. Mortgage rates are now nearing 7%. They were down below 2% or 2.5% in the United States. The average during the housing bubble was 5.5%, 6%. They're just going back to normal. And the basic treasury rates are also then rising. But this is something that's been postponed for and been ongoing for over 14 years, or certainly approximately around 14 years, given the Lehman Brothers collapse. But the mortgage crisis and the collapse of Bear Stearns hedge funds tied to the mortgage-backed securities happened in the summer of 2007, when the liquidity process was already begun. There was just a political decision to let Lehman go. Just like there was a political decision not to intervene into a liquidity crisis in 1932 by the Federal Reserve. These are political decisions. People say it's an independent central bank. It's not independent. It makes political decisions independent of the population, independent of the political will or interests of the nation per se. It makes decisions based on a business or financial class. Or we can just say a class, really ultimately. And this happened in Great Britain. As rates began to rise, the market began to respond to those rates rising or to other circumstances, including the shortage of fuel, the coming depression, the lack of economic growth. I mean, shipping rates from the trans-Pacific shipping costs, to give a sense of the physical breakdown, which is not just Germany. China is in still COVID lockdown policies. They've got a major political summit where Xi Jinping will be elected likely for a lifetime appointment as president at the end of this month. They still have severe lockdowns throughout China, partly because COVID is so infectious. It's just, you have to just let it spread at some point, which should have been the case from the very beginning, except, with anyone under 55, 60, let it burn in some ways. But the point on trans-Pacific rates, the consumption levels in the US have collapsed, and priorities like making sure you can buy food and gas have outweighed a lot of other purchases. That shipping rates from the trans-Pacific have gone from $19,000 for a container last year, which was down to around $14,000 per container earlier this year, have collapsed to around $4,000 now, nearly a 20% what it was merely a year ago in terms of economic, kind of consumer-based, globalization-based trade and activity, where cheap labor, questions of supply. which really means it's a good time to transition. But we are dealing with an economic crisis. And as rates rose in London, it threatened a huge pension system. Basically, like, I don't know the pension system in Great Britain really at all. This is just reports. But you can consider it like if the Social Security system was going to go under, like the investments it had made were about to go, which it's not based on that. It's based on a different dynamic. But if that was going to go based on an investment practice, that basically treasury bonds it was holding, which were at 0%, you can now get treasuries at 4%. The treasuries at 0% become increasingly devalued. Who wants a treasury at 0% when you can get one at 4%? And so but basic rates, right? You need a basic interest rate. You need a functioning basic interest rate, right? If a small bank, local bank is going to be writing mortgages, it needs to make enough money on that mortgage to offer you some money, some interest on your deposits. That way you put your money in that bank. So a 6%, 7%, something around there is a normal basic rate for banks in the banking system to function. And yet to even just approximate that threatens trillions of dollars of basic investments. Now, it wasn't probably just pensions. It might have been a lot of other firms. Likely it is. In reality, you have to realize since the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, the banks have been so overly regulated by 30,000-page bills that most of the money and investments have gone to things like private equity. These are privately held corporations. You have no idea what these companies are doing. You have no idea what the investment practices are to a large degree. It's unregulated. It's not a bank. Hence, the nature of why Dodd-Frank and massive government regulation fails, but why something like Glass-Steagall, a 10-page bill that basically says we're going to distinguish between physical investments and speculative, that's a different question. But we've now pushed much of our financial activity out of sight of any regulation, or even no one really knows where the predominance of bets and investments lie in the process. And there aren't board members, well, there may be board members, but there aren't necessarily stockholders in the same transparency. So what you have is record inflation, which probably far supersedes the 8 or 9% they're referencing, which is the ostensible basis for the Federal Reserve and other central banks to begin raising rates. That inflation is continuing. Majority of the country feels like much of its income is getting eaten away in rising prices. People have become dependent on extensive drives and travel for work or to see family. People have to fly to see family. Flights have gone up in a massive percentage, 30, 35, 40%. We're getting close to Thanksgiving and Christmas. Are you not going to see family? If you're driving to work an hour each way, or if you drive and you do construction, your sites change. All of a sudden you go from 15-minute drive to 45. How much more is that costing you now? There is a real squeeze on the population. And what the leadership, like probably expressed perhaps in some ways best by the what we call President Macron of France. You need a magnifying glass to see him. Your quality of life is going to decrease. Things are going to get tougher, but we have to defend democracy. And democracy is not democracy. It's much more a cult of the green energy in this dynamic. The shut down energy supply, go electric. Oh, Bloomberg says we'll be able to charge every car. Don't worry, Bloomberg says. Or Jeffrey Sachs. People see Jeffrey Sachs on this Ukraine stuff. You have to just push that guy. This is Harvard economics. This is the guy that went and basically ruined the former Soviet Soviet economy countries or countries in South America. Now they're touting him around as an expert on COVID and the Ukraine war, and he's a great peacemaker. Some of these things just make you vomit how the enemy operates and how people buy it. So for people that watch the Gray Zone, you know what I'm talking about. People buy almost anything as long as it's somebody so-called influential. But if you get a sense of what we're looking at, they want to insist now that under the threat of nuclear war that they've provoked, Kamala Harris basically insisted. She basically said, Putin, you're a chicken if you don't invade. She went to Germany in February at a security conference and said, Ukraine, join NATO. Come to NATO. She was deployed to say that, to basically poke Putin in the eye, to poke Russians in the eye and say, we dare you. We dare you to invade. That's why the idea that, did Putin really think this was going to be a negotiation? So all of this is kind of a dystopian picture. Financial crisis, a financial system caught in a catch-22, a lot of factional fights between Europeans, perhaps those in Asia, Americans, who knows, fighting over who can somehow survive this massive financial bubble. Maybe everyone can write it off. If we go into a world war, that might be nuclear, we won't survive. Well, why don't we just shut down the energy and start to reduce the population, control their quality of living, and tell them it's for the greater cause of democracy and our cultural values. Maybe they'll buy that. While they mutilate the children over ideology and so on. So that's very much the strategic picture. Germany is probably getting restless. That Nord Stream pipeline still has a string operational. At what point in this winter is Germany going to have a revolt? There were tens of thousands of people in Paris. There are thousands of people in Italy. There are thousands of people in other parts of Europe protesting on a weekly basis at this point over peace, over shut down the current foreign policy, change it, turn the heat back on, keep the lights on, develop the country. But there's nothing like what we have in the United States. There are expressions of it. But this movement we have developing here, when we went to the Trump rally a week and a half ago here in Michigan, it was very clear that the people attending, which were activists from all the various aspects of politics in Michigan, to a large degree, people that are active, they're not just sitting around and then waiting to go to a Trump rally. He was mobilizing the mobilizers. There's no support for a war in Ukraine. There's no support for Biden's corruption. There's no support for, as it relates to the Ukraine situation. It's blatantly apparent how the strings are pulled and who's connected to what in this situation. There's no support for Wall Street and these global corporations. You are building up a kind of movement, but that is expressive of the real American Revolution. And if you haven't yet, Bob Ingram's series on Washington, that was just finished last Saturday, was 3 parts, again expresses a quality of American outlook where who was Washington? Wasn't college educated, wasn't very educated, but he had that sense of when you take off the oppressive culture of oligarchs, the natural tendency of creative people who have an emotional, profound sense that life is about contributing to the process of creation, that you go out and engage that. He transformed his entire farm. He built entirely new industries, new capabilities, new technologies. And when the time came to defend his country, he was willing to move to the Appalachian Hills and fight guerrilla war if it was necessary, because he knew that this opportunity to unleash, right, not a Hobbesian contract, not a Lockean contract, not a sense that we have to repress these bestial desires within the population. Washington was fighting for a kind of culture and political system that allowed that creative quality of the human species to be unleashed. That doesn't exist as a political tradition in any other part of this world. And you have people like Christina Caramo, young Black woman running for Secretary of State. There are people, whether they're Hispanics from the border or other parts of the country, African Americans. We've got a really fascinating Vietnamese candidate for Congress in Northern Virginia. But you have a diverse field of people from various backgrounds, some very religious, some military, some economic, some just working class people that have been thinking about how this society could function much better. And the question is to create a unity, a depth, and a focus, and to make sure that we triumph around the big questions, that we make more conscious than ever before that people like Washington and Lincoln are not cartoon type creatures that we might worship as good people, but that we better understand the philosophical and intellectual commitments, not academic, but the deeper intellectual, poetic, artistic, scientific questions that they recognized was the pursuit of a free people, that a free people are free to the extent that they can pursue and do pursue these profound questions. That quality, that intellectual depth of the average American, of the so-called Latin farmer of our tradition, remains the most dominant strategic factor in the world today. It is not the threat of war. It is not the screaming of the danger of nuclear war to somehow cattle rush people into a certain direction, which is partly what Biden was probably doing up at Murdoch's house when he talked about Armageddon. He's trying to scare billionaires into giving him more money because that's all they have, money and abortion in this election. Talk about a cynical campaign. And so on that basis, we have something much rich and much more depth, much deeper and more profound. And to me, that's the basis of the discussion we want to have tonight. I've kind of done a more extensive overview, but hopefully it was worthwhile. I'd like to hear what people are thinking about the strategic situation, questions, and then your thoughts in general. So Susan, why don't we open it up and see what the response is?
Okay.